Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Here I am on King Edward Street in Oxford. Behind me, on that wall, in between the two first floor windows, you'll see the plaque about Cecil John Rhodes. You probably can't read it from this distance, but it says in the house, in this house, the Right Honourable Cecil John Rhodes kept academical residences in the year 1881. This memorial is erected by Alfred Mosley in recognition of the great services rendered by Cecil Rhodes to his country. It's got laurel wreaths below, image of Cecil Rhodes in the middle, and up high the coat of arms of Oriel. That was his college. So, Cecil Rhodes, he needs an introduction these days. Well, he was born in 1850, if memory serves, in Worcestershire, and his father was a Church of England clergyman. Now, the clergy, they had high social status, not necessarily well paid, depend on the parish. None of them were actually poor, but they could be like average middle class income, and some of them were very wealthy if they were in an affluent parish who was not so well off. So he had several brothers. He had no sisters, so far as I know. But anyway, he suffered from infirmity, particularly he had some respiratory condition, and he was advised to go to South Africa for his health, where the warmer, drier climate would be more suitable to his fragile constitution. So he went out there to join some of his elder brothers already there. They had a farm. And then he got into mining. First of all, it wasn't the actual mining he was doing, it was supplying the miners, selling them tents, mining equipment, food, alcohol, whatever else they needed. Eventually he got into mining and became very wealthy indeed. However, he'd only been in South Africa a couple of years when he returned to Oxford. Well, didn't return, matriculated at Oxford University. And his college was Oriel. However, the damp climate of the Thames Valley was had such a deleterious effect on his fragile health that he could only spend a few months here at a time, then return to South Africa, regain his health, and then come back here for another couple of terms, something like that, which is why he took taking about 10 years to graduate, because he kept toing and froing. So that was that. Obviously, they didn't do a subject as such, they picked and mixed, and it was heavily classical, Latin and ancient Greek. When he came here, women had just been admitted, 1878, to Lady Margaret Hall, but they were a tiny minority of the university, hardly mingled with him. That's another thing, is he seems to be misogynistic. They say power's a great aphrodisiac. Well, Kissinger said that anyway. Certainly not in the case of Rhodes. He never married, he never had a girlfriend, and he seemed to be very hostile to women. He would hold all-male dinner parties. In those days that wasn't so uncommon, but sometimes people would have dinner parties where they invite their friends and their wives, and might like to socialise with women, not even if they had any romantic intentions towards them. Was he a repressed homosexual? I don't think there's any credible evidence he had any homosexual liaisons, and many gays are very affectionate towards women. Well, whatever he was, he certainly disliked women and never wanted to spend time with them. There was a Polish princess who had the hots for him, who chased him all around Cape Town, desperate to marry him. He was, by some accounts, the richest man in the world, which would have made him quite an eligible bachelor. But anyway, these days he is a highly controversial figure, and he is alleged to have said, "I prefer land to N," using the N word. Now, bear in mind, it wasn't such a loaded term back in the 19th century, it's more of a matter-of-fact term. Was it just slang? Obviously, by the 60s, many black people took the gravest possible exception to this, saying it's a foul racial epithet. But another point is perhaps the prejudicial attitudes that are insinuated by the usage of that word were more widespread and accepted in the 19th century. So I don't think I can clear him charges of racialism on those grounds. So he was certainly a megalomaniac. He said, "I would annex whole planets if I can." And he was an English supremacist, saying, "Remember that you're an Englishman and thus won first prize in the lottery of life." So he dreamed of Cairo the Cape, of annexing Africa that much. He had a plan to conquer the Holy Land, what we now call Palestine and Israel, and so forth. So he was involved with the British South Africa Company, and he sent them to negotiate with Lobengula, who was the king of the Ndebele people, or you can call them Matabele. They lived in what's now Zimbabwe. They defeated the Shona majority there about 40 years before, had an agreement with them, the Rudd concession, because Mr. Rudd negotiated it. Was it deliberately mistranslated? That's what some people said. Mining rights, then it seemed to be the rights to actually own all the land, and Lobengula thought that he'd been conned. There was a rebellion, he was defeated, there was a Chimurenga uprising, and some of the rebel leaders were executed. and one of those before he was put to death said, "My bones shall rise again." And the 1970s, when the black nationalists rose up against white mastery, they called it the Second Chimurenga. Bones were rising again. Perhaps this is another reason why Robert Mugabe was not eager to negotiate at the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979. He felt it would be a second Lobengula, even though he's a Shona, that he might be tricked by Britishers again. So this is Cecil Rhodes. He later became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Remember, South Africa as such wasn't united until 1910. The Union of South Africa was then created. It's now the Republic of South Africa. So Zambia and Zimbabwe were named in his honour. Zimbabwe was Southern Rhodesia, Zambia was Northern Rhodesia, and on the flag of Rhodesia, as it then was, it bore the legend Sit Nomine Digna. Those Latin words can be construed as "may she be worthy of the name," as in the name of Rhodes. Now, it might seem that it was worthy, but not in a good way, as in Rhodes is such a demon that the racialist society that he established really was a fitting legacy to a man who was so avaricious and exploitative. Towards the end of his life, he changed his tune a bit and said, no, we should not exclude black people from the franchise. We ought to have the right to vote for civilized people, whatever the race. So yes, a tiny number of black people would be allowed to vote, but he saw that developing and more black people would be permitted to vote. Some of these rights were stripped from black South Africans in the 1930s. So in that sense, he was a bit ahead of his time. There was the Jameson raid, and he was the Eminence Crise of that, encouraging his doctor, Leander Starr Jameson, to attack the Transvaal and try and overthrow it, because lots of Britishers moved into the Transvaal and the Orange Free State because they're involved in mining, and the people who ruled those countries were Afrikaners, as in Dutch-speaking white South Africans. The black majority were virtually excluded from all political power. So on the spurious basis of the British community being persecuted there, Jameson launched this coup. However, it was failed, and he was sent back to the British to be sentenced. The Afrikaners didn't execute him on the basis that that would canonise him. So, but Rhodes managed to avoid being officially embroiled, and that was not prosecuted for that. And things appeared to go slightly wrong from in 1899 when the Second South African War broke out. And yes, the British won it in the end, but it was not the cakewalk that some had expected. It turned into a guerrilla conflict, and such conflicts really are never glorious for the stronger army, who don't win quickly and don't win cleanly. And he died just as that came to an end. At the age of 52, dying at his hut, with his words, so little done, so much to do. So he's interred in Zimbabwe on a mountain in the middle of a national park. I can't remember what it's called actually. And even though he is detested by most Zimbabweans, they have not shifted his body, because there is a very strong ethic against disturbing the immortal remains of the dead. And that's why he still has that position of honour atop a mountain. When King George VI visited Zimbabwe in 1947, he made a pilgrimage to the tomb of Cecil Rhodes. You wouldn't do that these days. It shows you just how dramatically times have changed. And indeed, Elizabeth II, she was then a princess, she visited his grave as well, way back in 1947. So there's this been Rhodes Must Fall movement has been very active. It was very active a couple of years ago. It seems to have fallen by the wayside. And a South African undergraduate, he was a black chap, he really objected to Rhodes being glorified in this way, and he wanted it removed. Rhodes must fall. Like Rhodes University in South Africa has been renamed. Likewise, Zambia and Zimbabwe have obviously dropped his name long ago. Say it's a racist symbol. The thing is, that was put up shortly after he died in 1902. That reflects the attitudes of over a century ago. Do we have to remove it now? Some say that we do. So here is Oriel. I'm on Oriel Square. Here's the main part of Oriel, where he studied. So it's just around the corner, because people usually lived in their college. Here's more of Oriel. People usually lived in their college in those days, and his college was the last one to go mixed, quite appropriately, class boys' college to take girls, but the girls' college to take boys, St Hilda's, that only were mixed about 10 years ago. So some people say it's taking over public space, it's grossly insulting, there's a violence to seeing his image. Or do we have to say, well, those are the attitudes of a bygone era, and he reflected the outlook of people at the time? Did he do some good for these people? Science and technology and medicine, they all came on leaps and bounds in just a few decades of colonial rule. So does that mitigate his wrongdoing at all? And yes, he'd invaded what we now call Zambia and Zimbabwe, but Ndebele had invaded only 40 years earlier, but nobody thinks they're incredibly wicked or Lobengula can't be commemorated. So that's a controversial figure of Cecil John Rhodes, who's now almost universally execrated. He did set up the Rhodes Scholarship, and the chap who led the Rhodes Voice 4 campaign profited from that and saying, well, no, I'm not honouring his legacy because he plundered my country, and as he robbed us blind, it's right that I should derive a little bit of benefit from his filthy lucre. I'm just getting back a tiny fraction of what was stolen. So the Rhodes Scholarship was for men, it did say men only, and they were from British Empire countries except the United Kingdom, Germany and the United States. He wanted the United States to rejoin the British Empire. He foresaw the possibility of a war between Germany and the United Kingdom, but he felt if enough influential Germans studied here, they would form such a positive opinion of the UK that war would be averted. Well, it didn't quite work, because these things only started in 1903, the year after his death, and these people, these Germans who were pro-British, were not in a sufficiently senior position by 1914 to stop the war. Well, here we are on Oxford High Street, and this is a bit of the college that Rhodes paid to be extended. You can see various bishops up there, and you can see, I have to go further. This gate, I've only once ever seen it open, this gate of, and there's the Oriel symbol, and there's another image of Rhodes I'll show you when I'm able to cross over the high street, and there's a Latin inscription honouring him. It's very notable that the inscription on there, on his memorial over there, was in English, not Latin, because until the 19th century we did virtually all things in Latin. There up high, that's an image of Rhodes, and the Latin words saying how he paid for the college to be enlarged. There's King Edward VII, who was king at the time, and there's King George V as well, his son, and a few bishops. Yeah, I remember being in some of these rooms with my friends many moons ago. That is Cecil John Rhodes.